Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Cagle here at Fort Ticonderoga.
And I'm TJ Mullen.
And we have one more grouping of objects in our Revolutionary Anthology exhibit, and this time it's something a little bigger. It is a world war.
So, of course, in 1775, war breaks out here in North America, and at first it's really just a conflict between a colony and a greater power, Great Britain. And then in 1776, of course, we declare independence, and it becomes an official act of war between two nations fighting each other. But fighting is not just limited to North America, is it? It becomes a global war.
Absolutely, yeah. Things spiral out after particularly 1778, when the French signed treaties with now the United States, as you say, and we get an imperial conflict between Britain and France alongside our war for independence. And that escalates as this war continues. So you get in 1779 the Spanish entering the war. By 1780 you get the Dutch entering the war. On the other side of the world, the English are fighting a war with the King of Mysore in India. So this is truly a global conflict. And even beyond the fighting that's happening between these different powers, it's important to remember that back in Europe and other parts of the world, people are still managing this conflict that is going on, because just like today, even if you don't start the war, and even if you're not in it, you have to face the repercussions. So we see back in Europe, for instance, some major powers like Prussia and Sweden and Russia forming a league of armed neutrality to be prepared militarily to maintain their own independence and neutrality within this expanding global conflict. And fortunately, here in the museum, we've got a number of objects that relate to this broader period of again, global war that kind of spirals out of the American Revolution.
Yeah, we've got a great little assemblage of objects here relating to some of those nations. And first thing I'm looking at are these two beautiful colored prints, which are from France. We have a print here, which is a classical reference to Poseidon and Athena fighting over the patronage of the city of Athens. So we've got a French woman here who represents Athena, her lance is on the ground there, and then an English sailor with a ship kind of like being wrecked in a storm over there, and they're both playing tug of war with Poseidon's trident there, and they're not claiming patronage over Athens, but
yes.
Granada.
Yeah. This is not about Greece at all. They're taking that metaphor and applying it to the current conflict.
And that's a classical reference that people at that time would have.
Yeah, a well-educated person would have known some of these reference points, and it even says it in the text down there, but it does substitute the island of Grenada for Athens in this case. Grenada being one of these West Indian islands that are, of course, extraordinarily valuable to these European empires, because through the forced labor of enslaved Africans, they are producing sugar and coffee and the most valuable commodities that are available in this Atlantic marketplace. And so when wars start between these powers, of course, they become battlefields. And that's true of the American Revolution, the broader Revolutionary War, as it was for earlier, and as it will be for later conflicts, at least until the end of slavery. And what it's referencing here too is that, it's telling that Poseidon is the English sailor, because the English are known for their massive Royal Navy, which allows them to move troops to control a vast global empire. And what this is showing in these classical terms is France usurping that power. So the English ships in the background are foundering at sea as France is pulling away the power in this broader war. And France does make gains in the Caribbean, capturing British islands, trying to capture others that it doesn't, kind of throwing the British off guard, and is ultimately one of the contributing factors to American independence, is that the British are tied up with other stuff going on elsewhere.
Yeah. And so this is really sort of a continuation almost of the war that was fought in the past decade, also in North America, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War as it's known in North America.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't often think about the French and Indian War from an American perspective as happening outside of here, but that was a global conflict as well, and a lot of the campaigning happened in the West Indies around some of these various same waters and islands that we see in the Revolutionary War.
So one reason France might have entered the war was to sort of reclaim its supremacy over some of the Caribbean and other places that had lost during the French and Indian War. But I think also these ideas of liberty and freedom are also starting to come out of France with the Enlightenment thinkers. And what's this print about? Looks like we have an American who's wearing a cap that says Congress on it,
Yeah.
and we have three people who are chained up and are being flogged by the American. Who are these people, and what does this represent?
Yeah, so this is another print coming out of France, out of Europe, depicting this perspective of the French really supporting and chastising the English. And like you say, the French entry into the war has a number of different factors. One of those being to redress the balance of power that they see having shifted too far to England during the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, the British capture of various Caribbean islands, of virtually all of Eastern North America, territories elsewhere, has left them with an empire that they feel is too big, too powerful. The French are trying to knock them back a peg. And of course, aggrandize themselves as well. And this is showing how the light, the sun, the rays, the thunderbolts of the King of France, shining upon and punishing the English with the help of the Americans, their new allies here, not only wearing this cap with Congress, but wearing a kind of European interpretation of a hunting shirt, this uniquely American military uniform. And he is literally chaining and whipping three figures that represent England, Scotland, and Ireland. The English figure is dressed very much like this other print as a sailor, which makes sense for this maritime nation. It's a little unclear what the distinction of the Scotswoman is here and the Irishman in a uniform, but they're definitely supposed to represent these parts, the kingdoms of the British Isles, and their punishment at the hands of the King of France, who has now entered the war. And once again, the motif in the back of foundering ships with English flags, showing France's increasing power. France had substantially increased and modernized their navy in the wake of the 7 Years' War, as well as their army, and they're sending that back out in the field. And so this is meant to convey that this global war is now shifting in France's favor.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the French enter in 1778 officially, but they're not the only ones who ally themselves with this new nation of the United States or the United Colonies. The Dutch are also involved too. So when do they get involved, in what ways?
Yeah, the Dutch are kind of one of the least well-known co-belligerents, because again, I think it's important to remember that when we talk about some of these nations that enter the war against the British, particularly Spain, they don't ally officially with the United States. They don't necessarily acknowledge the existence of the United States. They are co-belligerents against the British. And the Dutch get brought into this in a kind of roundabout way. They had been neutral beginning of the war. They were neutral in the 7 Years' War as well. The Dutch being one of the few examples of a republic in Europe, which is kind of interesting, although a kind of complicated, clunky republic that also has a kind of a not a royal family, but a noble family that is key to the country as well. But the Dutch, through their own Caribbean possessions in the West Indies, particularly islands like Curacao and St. Eustatius, become neutral ports that military goods are being funneled to America for the American Rebellion. So things like this infantry hanger here, I mean, this is a pretty typical kind of Dutch infantry sword that a soldier might carry, are the kind of things that are coming through the blockade of North America, and they're coming from neutral countries through neutral ports from all over Europe and then getting transshipped to America. So the British can't legally interdict a lot of this traffic because it's neutral. But it's carrying swords, it's carrying guns, it's carrying gunpowder, fabric, all these things that are needed by the American military. The British would love to do this, but again, the laws of war, the customs of nations prevent them from doing this until we get to a point where an American official traveling to Europe has his ship intercepted by the British, and he tries to throw away his papers, which include a kind of a draft negotiation between the city of Amsterdam and the United States. So not the actual Dutch Republic, but Amsterdam specifically. And he tried to throw this into the ocean. Some intrepid English sailor jumps out, grabs it, and the English find this, and they say, hey, this is the evidence that we need to bring the Dutch into the war. They're trying to make these negotiations with the Americans, and by 1780, the English declare war on the Dutch. The Dutch are now brought into this conflict, and it adds to this global conflagration. The English go after some of these islands, particularly St. Eustatius, which they capture. The French recapture it later on, but they're able to slow some of this trade. They're also able to make a great deal of money for themselves because of these kind of things. And that's, to a large extent, the Dutch involvement. Dutch forces troops in Europe don't directly go into the field against the British. We do have this great portrait of a Dutch officer from the Unterwater Regiment about the time. I mean, the painting was probably done around the time of the opening of war against the British, around 1780 or so. This regiment at the time was stationed in the southern part of the United Provinces, the southern part of the Netherlands. And he's got a typical uniform for the Dutch army from this time period of a dark blue coat, the distinguishing details being in his hat and his sash.
Orange sash.
Yeah, run through there. We have Orange for the House of Orange, the noble family that led the Dutch through their War of Independence to create their republic and have a strong role within the republic, which is represented in their uniforms. But while this is a national regiment, so of Dutch nationals in the army, it's important to remember that the Dutch, not only do the Dutch contribute to this global war, they have a multifaceted military. So they have Dutch national troops, they also have Germans, they have Swiss, they even have Scots regiments in the Dutch army. And in fact, when the Dutch at the beginning of this war were neutral, the British had approached them about having the Scotch Brigade, which are these Scottish troops in Dutch service that still wore red uniforms, and sending them back into the field against the American rebels. And the Dutch denied this request, just like the Empress of Russia, Catherine, denied the British request for Russian troops to go to America, which is eventually why they go to Germans. But that was part of this conversation. Let's bring these Scottish troops back into British pay and send them to America. And eventually one of the repercussions of this conflict between the Dutch and the British, which is not the Revolutionary War to them, they call it the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, following up on 3 conflicts that happened between the Dutch and the English in the 17th century. But as a process, their army becomes increasingly nationalized, and so that kind of Scottish character and the kind of greater British identity of those Scottish troops in Dutch pay goes away. As this conflict is happening in the early 1780s, and a lot of those troops go back to wearing blue Dutch uniforms rather than the red British uniforms, and a lot of the Scottish officers end up going back to Great Britain eventually over time. They lose that kind of Scottish character as one of the repercussions, not on the battlefield, but of the kind of diplomacy and politics of this broader period.
Interesting. Yeah. So we know that there are Germans coming to America and fighting alongside British soldiers. But there's also stuff going on in Germany. And Germany is not the same as it is today. It's not a unified state. It's a series of principalities and landgravats and duchies and kingdoms. And I think Prussia, so this is a Prussian musket and bayonet here, are probably one of the most well-known kingdoms of Germany at that time. And what were the Prussians up to?
Yeah. So, like you say, Germany is this patchwork as the center of the Holy Roman Empire of sometimes, cities that are their own independent kind of city-states, free cities, all the way up to big kingdoms like Prussia, and of course, the biggest real kind of German state being the Austrian Empire, that also holds the title of Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And Prussia has risen over the 18th century to be a kind of a rival to Austria. We see this over a lot of the conflicts of the mid-18th century. Prussia, of course, wants to remain a certain neutrality internationally during this broader period of conflict. They're part of this League of Armed Neutrality. They, through their king, Frederick II, Frederick the Great, actually disapproves of sending Germans, Hessians, Brunswickers, and others on behalf of the British to North America, and actually blocks some of their progress through Prussian territories to get to the ocean and the English Channel to be able to be sent there. They're concerned about their own interests, of course, at home. And then, we also have during this time period, not technically part of the American Revolution, but there's a conflict that breaks out in 1778 called the War of the Bavarian Succession over who is heir to the throne of Bavaria and their territories in the Rhineland. And this shakes out as a war between Prussia and Austria over whose guy is going to be there. It eventually ends up in more or less in Prussia's favor. The war sees a lot of campaigning over 1778 and 1779 in Central Europe, but it doesn't result in a lot of pitched battles, although it's notable for a lot of logistical failures that leave thousands of soldiers dead and incapacitated through illness, not through the battlefield. But it's important to remember that throughout this time, there are innovations that are being made in Europe, and I think this musket is an interesting example of this, because this is probably what some of those Prussian soldiers are carrying into action during the War of the Bavarian Succession. The overall style of this musket, it's a standard smoothbore flintlock musket like we're familiar with. It has on its thumb plate here a little cipher FR for Fredericus Rex, so King Frederick, which indicates that it's a Prussian weapon. The overall pattern is really one from the 1740s that had seen the Prussians through the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. One of the big innovations that we see here, though, is on the ramrod. It's got this massive iron ramrod underneath here. So it doesn't, diminish down in size like a lot of ramrods we see. And part of this is because it was an attempt to speed up the loading process for these muskets so that you could simply draw that rammer out and instead of having to reverse it, just rely on the weight of this massive piece of metal to drive the round home, which theoretically increases your rate of fire. There's a couple other countries that are experimenting with this around this time. The Dutch adopt a similarly heavy ramrod in 1777. Doesn't seem to have caught on much more broadly, so I don't know how effective it was ultimately in the end, but this is definitely a Prussian musket from the later 1770s, early 1780s, that is the time that Frederick's forces were going into the field with for the last time. And it's important to remember that the War of the Bavarian Succession is Frederick the Great's last war. Yeah. Maybe not ending on a high note, but certainly not ending with defeat. It is interesting also to remember that it is Prussia that just after the American Revolutionary War ends, signs a treaty with the United States that acknowledges our independence, I think becoming only the second country to officially acknowledge American independence and enter into a treaty of commerce with us.
Yeah, so I'm curious about that because 1781, famously, Washington delivers the final blow to Cornwallis in Yorktown with the help of the French.
Yep.
And then in 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed and ends the war. Do these nations recognize the United States as an independent nation, as a sovereign nation?
It happens over time. So all of this takes time. Even the Treaty of Paris takes until 1784 to finally get ratified and have it officially on the books. The Prussian treaty comes a little after that. So it takes time for these nations to kind of get into line. But the writing's on the wall. The United States has proven its independence, and it's proven that independence in no small part because the British are occupied with all of these other things going on. Campaigning in North America continues long after Yorktown, and especially when we think about globally, campaigns in the West Indies, some of the major naval campaigns of the war happen after Yorktown. The Franco-Spanish siege of Gibraltar is still going on after this. There's still combat in India that's happening well into 1782 and 83. So the war keeps going on well after Yorktown. And again, this is one of the things that applies pressure to the British to just end this American issue and get on with acknowledging American independence and what that new world has brought.
So where can people see these objects?
All of this material and some more is going to be on display in our Revolutionary Anthology gallery over the course of 2026, and this video and content about these is available on our online collections database on Fort Ticonderoga's website.